So we want to look at what such an approach looks like, why we should aspire to it, and in order to get there, really, how we can understand addiction, what drives it, where it originates, what makes it so hard to overcome, and nevertheless, how we might try. And there really are few people better placed to comprehensively and sensitively answer these questions and many more than our guest this evening. He's one of the world's most revered experts in the study of addiction, now retired physician who, after 20 years of family practice and palliative care experience, worked for over a decade, as I'm sure we will hear more of, in Vancouver's downtown east side, treating some of the people with the most severe cases of drug addiction and mental illness. He's an internationally renowned speaker. I'm sure many of you will already know this very well. I'm sure many of you will have heard him speak, and the author of a number of best-selling books, including the award-winning book, which I'll put on my screen now, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction, which I'm afraid I've sort of battered and bruised over its reading over the last few days. It's as relevant now as when he first wrote his first edition, which was a while ago now, but it is the book on which we will draw much of our discussion, from which we'll just draw much of our discussion over the next hour. So really, I must stop talking. There's a lot to get through and to ask him. Gabor Maté, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Hannah.
So we tend to think of addiction often as relating to drugs and to sort of harmful substances. And I'm sure many people have signed into this event thinking they want to know more, perhaps help a loved one, but not necessarily because they think themselves an addict. But once you're done, I expect many people might think differently. So I wonder if I could just jump straight in there and ask you to do what you define so well, which is, what is an addict in your terms? What qualifies as addiction?
Yes, there's, as you say, a common myth that addiction has to do with drugs. And of course, it does, but not only with drugs. An addiction, the source of the word itself is a Latin word for a kind of slavery. So an addiction is any behavior that we're slave to. So my definition of addiction, which by the way, right away obviates the question, is there such thing as a good addiction? It's like asking, is there such thing as good slavery? No, there isn't. An addiction by definition, by my definition, it's a complex process, but it's manifested in any behavior that a person finds temporary pleasure or relief in, and therefore craves, suffers negative consequences as a result of, but doesn't give it up or refuses to or cannot, despite negative consequences. So the hallmarks of addiction are craving, pleasure, relief, short-term, long-term harm, inability to give it up. That's what an addiction is. That definition says nothing about drugs. It includes any human behavior that is characterized by those features. That could be eating, shopping, gambling, self-harm, bulimia, work, extreme sports, pornography, sexual addiction, internet gaming, the internet itself. In other words, anything. And this is where, if I was in a room with participants and I would ask people to raise their hands if they recognize some addictive pattern in their life, in our society, 90% of people will put their hand up, and they usually do. And the other 10%, most of them are lying to themselves, or they don't know themselves well enough. But by and large, an addiction is rife throughout our society, according to my definition.
One of the things that in your definition you talk about repetitive, and it's something that your mind fixates on, you keep doing it in a repetitive pattern, but you emphasize it has to have a harmful impact on either yourself or on others. So if you are looking at some of those things you mentioned, so for example, I don't think you mentioned it, but caffeine or exercise, those are passions, are they addictions? There's no negative side effect necessarily from those things.
Well, that's the whole point. That is the key point. If there's no negative harm, if there's no negative consequence, if there's no harm, it's not an addiction. It's a passion. But you can't tell from the outside. It's the internal relationship to it that matters. I mean, I talk in my book very openly about my own addiction to shopping for classical music. The classical music itself can be a passion. You can just love it. But the addiction wasn't to the music, it was to the shopping. And I had to keep going back and back and back, despite the fact that I never even listened to much of what I had on my shelves already. And despite the fact that it cost money that was not reasonable to spend, $8,000 one week, that I was lying to my wife about it, that I was neglecting my family life for it, and even my work for it. So on the outside, you can just say, this guy just loves classical music. Well, he does, but his relationship to it is an addictive one. So it's that internal relationship that matters. And same with work. You can do work passionately, as long as you're conscious, and it has no negative consequences, or you can be addicted to it. So it all depends on the internal relationship and whether or not there's actual harm. I'll finally say that sometimes people don't know the harm. They might say, there's nothing wrong with me exercising all the time. Well, they might not be aware that it's taken a toll on their relationships. They might not be aware that it's diverting them from their anxiety. Instead of dealing with the anxiety, they're diverting themselves. So sometimes people have a hard time telling the harm. But having said that, you can relate to something passionately, which is not addictive, or you can relate to it addictively, which is a totally different matter.